truck here is a 1940 FK Mack. We bought the truck in 1985. We had restored the Sterling, and after I got done with the Sterling, I said, that's it. I didn't want any part of doing another truck. And that lasted for about maybe 6 months. And we decided at that point that we had to do something. So we took a ride up to see Francis Ryan. He had an FW, I believe, that we were interested in. And Francis kept bringing me over to this truck, and I kept telling Francis I didn't want this truck. I wanted the other truck. So we walked around the lot for probably 15 minutes, and Francis would keep dragging me back to this truck. And I kept saying, Francis, I'm not interested in that truck. So after about 2 hours, he kept working on me, and finally I went over and took a good look at the truck, and we decided we'd buy it. And when I first bought it, I wouldn't tell anybody what I paid for it, because they would have probably put me in a booby hatch. But I'll tell you, after the auction of the Wellington trucks, I felt pretty good about what I paid for it. Seeing a couple of those went for around $75,000 to $80,000 a piece. At that point, we brought the truck home and we stripped it, and I believe it sat outside for probably 2 to 3 years before we got back on it again. It took 5 years to restore it. We had originally had a 150 in it. We changed the engine to a 250, and we put a quadruplex behind the engine, and we had a new cab made with a heavy floor in it to take the air ride seats, and we were going to strap the interior to put a tuck and roll interior in it. And Dennis Jaworski and George Humphrey cornered me one day and asked me if I was all right. And I asked him why, what he was talking about. He says, do you realize what you have here? He says, you have the last FK tandem diesel left in the country. He says, you should restore it back to its original condition like it should be. So after they beat on me for about a half an hour, I started thinking about it. I said, geez, them fellows are probably right. So at that point, we had already had a new cab made. Now we had to have a second cab made. So I talked to George Humphrey, and he said he'd make me a new cab. And to make it right, he had gotten the blueprints from Cole and Chisholm down at the Mack Museum. He's telling me how the cab had 3 different rivets in it, different size, different shape rivets. And when I got the cab from George, I was really happy with it. He did a beautiful job on it. At the time we bought the truck, it had just a channel iron bumper on it with 2 pieces of steel welded back and bolted through the frame. So we're trying to figure what to put on it for a bumper, because at the time you could have had 3 different bumpers on this model truck. So I called Cole and Chisholm, and he asked me to give him the serial number of the truck. I gave him the serial number of the truck, and about a week later, the original blueprint for the bumper for this particular truck showed up. At that point, we brought it to All Steel, and you can see they made us a new bumper. My cousin Bob and I made the brackets to hold the bumper on. And then it was it took us about a total of 5 years to restore the truck from day one when we started till the time we finished. The rear end, one of the rear ends had a blown side gear in it. We had to get a new side gear, so we had it made. Which surprised me was the price was only $600 to get the gear made. Probably would have cost me the same thing over the counter if I could have got it at the time. The only place we cheated on the truck really is the engine had the rod hanging out through the side of the block when we got it. So instead of putting a 150 back in it, we put an NH250. But everything else on the truck is original except for the diamond plate and the chrome. I believe the only chrome would have been the tank on the top of the radiator. But the rest of the truck, as you can see, is original. It had the late style headlights when we bought it. We changed them. George Humphrey got me the original headlights for it. All the gauges we sent out to John Wolf, I believe I was out in Ohio, and he redid all the gauges, so they're all the same. He made me a tack out of a speedometer for it. You learn as you go along. I guess the engine should have been painted gray, but we came as close as we could as the Cummins yellow. Everybody figures there's a cat in there because of the yellow. It's kind of bright. But the engine should have been gray. When we bought the truck, the cradle was here for the winch, but there was no winch. My cousin Bob Amatucci, who did most of the body work on this truck, fabricated this whole carriage here, and then we mounted the winch before we assembled the truck. We put it all together, then we took it all apart again to paint it. And then for the last time we put it back on after it was all done painted. It's got all the original fuel tanks. The purists get a little crazy when they see this aluminum diamond plate because originally it was all steel. But we didn't feel like taping rags on top of it every time we climbed up on top of it to clean the truck or get in and out of the truck, so we made them aluminum. The other thing that's not quite original is the air cleaner and the lubrifiner. The air cleaner was under the hood, and the lubrifiner was also under the hood. But being the way I am, I wanted them on the outside, but at least I kept the original ball mason jar on the pre-cleaner. It's got the original mirrors on it, original style mirrors. Of course, the stack is chrome, which was no chrome back in them days. Well, I started in the gravel business in 1965, and the first tractor we owned was an FK single axle chain drive, which I believe was originally a Wellington truck. And we drove that truck for 2 years, moving our equipment around with a 25-ton boom. We used to move D8s and HD21s, which was quite a operation back then. I think if we'd ever caught, they'd have put us in jail and locked us up forever. But we got away with it. If you take a look at the cap here, you can see there's a grease fitting in it. The cans we had set up with maxi brakes on this, and we had to go out and find all original cans for it. We had a heck of a time, but after scrounging around through 3 or 4 junkyards, we finally came up with enough cans to do the truck. As you can see, they were original. You look at the suspension on this, it's a very unusual suspension. It's the early Mack, original Mack, and it has helper springs on all 4 corners. You can see it under there, plus the 2 main springs. It was probably a 65,000 pound setup on the rear end. And there's 2 cross members in here that we had to go to a foundry to get cast because the originals were cracked and we couldn't weld them. Every time we weld them, the crack would travel further, so I just gave up finally and brought them down to a foundry in Blackstone, Mass. And the fellow down there made molds for us and cast me 2 new cross members for it. The 5th wheel is the original 5th wheel that was on the truck. We had a heck of a time finding the original directional lights, but we did finally. We found the original reflectors, which these are glass, not plastic, and they come apart. If you break them, you can change these individually. Everything under the front end was completely rebuilt. All the brake shoes were painted before we put the linings on. All the drums were done individually before we reassembled them. All new bearings, all new brakes. Everything under the truck is brand new. Anything we couldn't buy, we made.
Jackhammering the walls apart so they could make the cellar bigger to put an addition on the right side of the building here.